When I was in my early teens, my family moved from the city out to the country. It was quite the transition going straight from a city life to living in a house that was at least a 15-minute drive from the nearest one over. My dad, however, had always dreamed of being a farmer, and since we were extremely comfortable financially, he was able to take a chance and pursue that dream. I had one older brother and one younger sister. Being the middle kid, I often had to feel like I was the bridge between the two. My brother was 16 at the time, and even though he was a pretty decent kid for the most part, like most older brothers, he occasionally liked to pick on me and my sister. I'll come back to that in a bit. My sister was 7 when we moved into the new house. It was a nice brick house on a ranch with a very large basement. The basement was half finished, meaning it had cinder block walls but still wasn't in any way exposed to the outside. It didn't have any carpeting or sheetrock like the rest of the house. My dad and my mom put all our toys down in the basement. It was officially our playroom, sort of. Not long after we moved in, though, my sister began to act very strangely. She began talking to herself when she was in the basement alone. The first time it happened, my parents asked her what was going on. She told them she'd made a new friend, Gus, an older man who liked to visit her in the basement. At first, my parents were quite alarmed, thinking someone must have broken into the house. It didn't take very long for them to determine that Gus seemed to be nothing more than a figment of my sister's imagination, though. Gus became a regular topic of discussion concerning my sister. She would bring up all the times he would come and talk to her in the basement. Often, I would hear her talking to this Gus. I would go down and check, just to see if anyone really was down there. Conveniently though, whenever I asked her, Gus had always left immediately before I came down. While the talking about Gus didn't really bother me, as I never had any imaginary friends myself and didn't understand why anyone would want to, my brother was sick and tired of hearing our sister talk about him all the time. He would just get aggravated at her and tell her to shut up about her dumb and fake friend. About 5 months later, our parents were in town and my brother was supposed to be watching my sister and I. My brother had this weird and annoying habit that whenever our parents weren't at home, he'd sneak into my parents' room and try to grab my dad's porno tapes. Then he would set them up and watch them in the middle of the living room. He did this because the picture window in the living room faced a long driveway, and he would know when my parents were coming home. My sister and I were always forbidden from going in there, not that I would have wanted to at that age anyway. On this day, my sister had once again been downstairs talking to Gus. I was in the kitchen grabbing myself a snack. Unexpectedly, my sister sprinted up the stairs and into the living room, surprising my brother. He had to very quickly shut the TV off. "Hey, Gus told me you were watching bad movies. You better stop that," my sister yelled at him. "Oh my God, I'm so damn sick of hearing about this Gus," my angry brother yelled in response. "There's no such person. Stop being an idiot." Of course, my sister got upset. My brother had made her cry. I came to her defense and told him that her talking about Gus didn't really hurt us in any way. He got irritated with me and told me I was encouraging her to act foolish. When I continued to defend my sister, my brother got up and grabbed me by the arm. "Oh yeah? Fine. Well, why don't you spend some time down there with him then?" He began to pull me over to the basement door. Now, I spent a lot of time in the basement by myself, so I wasn't really scared to be down there. Still though, no one likes to be forced somewhere they don't want to be. I struggled, but of course there was no way I could overpower my brother, who easily dragged me and shoved me down to the basement. Once I was in, he locked the door and yelled at me to make sure I say hi to Gus. I was so pissed off because I didn't want to be in the basement. I suddenly remembered that there was an outside door. There was a stairwell on the side of the house that led into the basement. The door at the bottom was locked from the inside. Feeling smart after having outwitted my brother, I turned to walk to the stairwell. I stopped dead in my tracks when I saw a grown man standing in the window of that door in the stairwell, staring down at me. He held up his hand and gave me a little finger wave. Then he took off. Now scared shitless, I ran up the stairs to the inside door my brother had locked and began to pound on it, screaming at my brother to open the door. I was yelling there was someone in our yard. Finally, I was able to get my brother to respond and let me out. I told him about the man in the stairwell. He sprinted out into the yard to look around, but of course no one was there. He initially chalked it up to me just wanting to give him a hard time about being an asshole, but when I described the man to my sister, she smiled and said, "Yeah, that was Gus." It was really freaky. I mean, I don't know who Gus was or if he meant my sister any harm. According to her, she never saw him again after. For months on end, though, my sister had been playing with an imaginary friend who was anything but imaginary. The only time my family ever moved when I was growing up was shortly after my youngest brother was born. There were already 4 of us siblings, and not nearly enough bedrooms to go around. My parents ideally wanted us all to have our own rooms as we got older, so they bought a 3-story Victorian-style house. Having a 3-story house was pretty damn neat, and I actually still own the house today. Definitely having my own bedroom for the first time ever was the neatest thing of all, though. There was 1 bedroom and 1 study on the top floor of the house, along with a bathroom. Then there was a door that led to a staircase that took you into the attic. It wasn't one of those attics you could live in, though. It was more of a place to store things in. That was really about it up there, though. There was no real ceiling either, just the pink insulation under the roof. In typical horror movie fashion, there were several things stored in the attic that the previous owners of the home had left there. Most of it wasn't anything of interest, though. Boxes of old books, tons of boxes full of National Geographic magazines. There was a desk with a vanity mirror on it and some poles with old clothes hanging down from them. I took the bedroom on the top floor simply because I thought it was the coolest room. It had a big outside window with a cushioned couch to sit on. I really liked it. None of my other siblings fought me for it either because it also happened to be the smallest bedroom in the home. I didn't really mind though because it was so cool. About 2 weeks after we moved in, I was laying in bed when I heard what I thought sounded like music coming down from the attic. I mostly dismissed it the first time. I figured it may have been coming from one of the other bedrooms, and I was simply confusing it as coming from above me. This, however, changed when the following night I heard the same song once again. It was an extremely faint tune, definitely coming from somewhere above me. The following day at breakfast, I asked my family if any of them had been in the attic the night before, or the night before that. They all seemed surprised at the question. When I told them I heard a small tune being played up there, they all just chalked it up to my imagination. How typical, huh? Well, the tune ended up not going away. I heard it again and again for the next several nights. It didn't play all night either, only for about 10 minutes at the same time every night. I honestly believed one of my siblings was messing with me. Eventually, I decided I would keep an eye on the door one night and see if any of them had gone up there. I would know for sure they were messing with me then. After going up in the attic one night just to make sure no one was in there, I turned my bedroom light off and crouched beside the door. I watched and saw that no one had come or gone into the attic. But at around 11 p.m., I once more heard the song begin to play. I was a bit scared now, but extremely curious as to what was going on here. I decided I would go into the attic and find out. I was more than a little bit afraid now, but my curiosity overrode my fear. I crept out of my room and slowly over to the attic door. I opened it up and turned on the attic light. I went up the stairs and kept expecting someone to jump out and grab me at any moment. Once I was up the stairs, I was able to finally tell where the music was coming from. It was coming from that desk with the vanity mirror. Going slowly over to it, I noticed that one of the drawers was now slightly open. I pulled it open all the way and took a look inside. Placed directly in the center of the drawer was this small music box playing the tune. I picked it up and inspected it. It was a simple box with a lid on it, still playing as I held it in my hands. Lifting the lid, I could see that it had a glass top on it that showed you the inner workings of the box. When I turned it upside down, though, I felt my heart begin beating in my chest. There was a wind-up lever on the bottom of the box. There was no way it could play on its own unless someone had wound it up, and that meant someone was in the attic with me. I hadn't seen anyone enter or leave since I'd begun watching. Quickly closing the box, I sprinted down the stairs and woke my dad. I explained to him what I'd found. He came to the same conclusion I did. He grabbed a bat and went to explore the attic. What he found gives me chills to this day. In the attic, off to the very far end, happened to be a very small door that led to a cubbyhole. We hadn't noticed it before. When he opened the cubbyhole, there was a small old woman cowering inside. She had empty cans of food and water and smelled foul as hell. He closed the hole back up and held it closed while my mom called the police. The woman happened to be the sister of the older lady we'd bought the house from. She was quite mentally ill and couldn't bring herself to leave the home when her sister moved. Instead, she chose to hide in the cubbyhole and only come out when we were all asleep. I guess the music box helped to soothe her. I have no idea why she left it in the drawer rather than taking it into the hiding place with her. Who knows how long she might have been able to hide up there if I hadn't heard that music box. It was quite a weird event. You know, paranoia is a very strange thing. It can really cause you a lot of problems, actually. But paranoia itself is not necessarily a bad thing. It can help you out often. I came into a good sum of money about 5 years ago. Some inheritance money. I don't really want to talk about how I obtained it. It brings up some very bad memories. Needless to say, though, I suddenly went from not having much money at all to having quite a lot of it. I remember growing up and watching that show Press Your Luck. It's the one where you win big prizes and money by spinning a big board and doing your best to avoid a whammy. Well, there was this one guy on the show named Michael Larson who won about $100,000. He, for some reason, kept the money in all cash and lost $50,000 of it when people from the neighborhood broke into his house because they knew he had the money. A lot of people in my neighborhood were aware of my inheritance as well, and although I wasn't stupid enough to keep my money in cash, I was very scared that people might break into my house to steal from me, or worse. I decided to go ahead and have a security camera system put up in my home. I had a bunch of small cameras placed in every room. They remained up for an extremely long time. It seemed for the longest time that putting them up had been nothing more than a sign of paranoia, though. I did eventually have someone break into my house, sure, but that event was quite odd. Although the sliding basement glass door had been busted, it was obvious someone had broken in, but it wasn't obvious why they'd broken in. Nothing was damaged or missing other than the door. It was a really strange event. Then I reviewed the security tape footage, and it got even weirder. On the tape, a person had fiddled with the door. Rather than busting it open, he was able to open it all on his own. When he walked in, he closed the door behind him carefully. He simply walked over to the security camera and stood there staring right at it. His head would sway from the left and then to the right, all while directly looking into the lens of the camera. A small smile eventually crossed his face. He stood there for a few more moments. After nearly an hour of doing this, he mouthed the words, "I'll come very soon." He then winked at me, thrust his hands in his pockets, and walked over to the door. He opened the door and then closed it behind him, only to violently smash it apart once he was outside. Apparently, he'd done this for no reason, unless it was his way of trying to let me know he'd gotten into the house. The videotape from the camera was his way to let me know he'd gotten in easily without making a single noise, and he could do it at any time. The police didn't know who he was, and they couldn't find him either. He never came back like he said he would. In a way, I wish he had, though. I mean, I was already paranoid before, but after watching that strange video, my paranoia gained a real face, and the longer time passed by, the more I expected him to come back and hurt me. Maybe he was just someone who wanted to make me paranoid, or maybe he's still out there and plans on coming back one day still. Who knows? I don't, but I sure wish I did. There's an abandoned house between my town and the town next to me on one of the country roads that connects us. I've been to it before and even gone inside twice with my sister and best friend. It's an old house that dates back centuries, at least according to the bank records I was able to find. You can kinda tell just by the design really. The house is 2 stories with a basement, has loads of furniture and objects strewn about inside, and is far from empty. You can tell it hasn't been lived in for decades, and whoever had previously owned it, it seems almost like they just disappeared one day, leaving everything behind. The way I was able to get in the first time was through the cellar door in the basement. It's broken open and propped up with some big sticks. My first visits were around 2 years ago, and I hadn't gone back in all that time. Another friend, though, expressed interest in seeing the house when I told him about my experiences. So, last summer, I told him I'd take him over to it. I never thought it was a dangerous trip. I told him it was just an interesting place to explore. We parked across the street from the house, in the parking lot of one of the industrial buildings nearby. The road was a rural road, but it was far from unused. We didn't want to be questioned by anyone as to why we were there. My friend, being much braver than I despite my previous visits, led the way across the street and to the front of the house. He asked me a couple of questions about it and what I'd seen in there. I told him the kitchen still even had expired food in it, and the upstairs had a board game set up that I ended up bringing home with me. As we walked from the front of the house to the side leading to the back with the cellar, I made note that there was a lot more brush around than when I had gone last. I had gone in the spring those years before, and I never experienced this thick bush I was now carefully moving through. I pointed this out to my friend to be careful, as we both tried to figure out where the path to the cellar was. Eventually, we pushed a big bush out of the way and found the cellar, broken and propped open exactly the same as I had last seen it. We talked for a second about being nervous, and I really took in the view of the cellar. It led to this dark, abandoned house. I remember being really intimidated while looking through the opening. I made a note as well that some of the items propping the cellar door open were not familiar to me. I didn't state this out loud, however, as I thought it was either just my anxiety or perhaps some other explorer who had visited in the meantime. My friend and I discussed who should go first. He said that since I was the expert of the home, surely I should head down first. I was extremely hesitant, of course, but eventually, after a good 5 minutes of breathing and calming myself down, I started down the steps of the cellar. It was an awkward entrance. Half the cellar was collapsed and left little room for maneuvering. You had to duck under the part of the cellar door that was still put together, then inch your feet down the steps. Finally, turn your body sideways to fit through the small gap into the basement. It took a long time after ducking under the door, since my nerves came back for a second. I made it in just fine though, and my friend followed quickly behind. We stood in the corner of the basement now, taking it in fully. I turned my phone's flashlight on, and he did too. There was a spider web in the path to the stairs up to the first floor. I looked around and found some sort of tool to knock it down. I took the tool and swiped through the web. After that, I tossed it back on the floor. My friend and I talked quietly. I don't remember what about. We fell silent soon, though. Above us, I could clearly hear footsteps on the boards above our heads. It seemed like they were heading to the stairs that led down to the basement. I remember this part the best. As I looked at my friend, he didn't seem to react to the footsteps I was hearing. I looked at him suddenly very worried. Before I could even say anything, he grabbed me. "We need to go now!" He turned around and practically jumped up the stairs. I remember thinking he was going insanely fast. I could feel his hand tugging me up. I was a bit slower, but I also got up pretty quickly. He pulled me out through the opening. I landed on my hands and knees after I escaped the cellar and immediately stood up in the weeds. I turned around to my friend, who was crouched and staring down inside. I said to him that we should get out of here, and he turned away. He told me to go first through the weeds. I pretty much just ran through the brush, definitely getting cut up by some of them. We made it through them though and back to the front of the house fairly quickly. My friend kept urging me to go in front of him as he watched behind us. He switched to flashing his light in the windows of the first floor of the front of the house. I asked him what he was doing. He didn't really answer me, so I asked him if he'd heard the footsteps before we bolted out of the basement. He turned to me and said that he had heard them, and that's why he was watching the cellar to see if anyone was following us out. He continued to say that after he'd pulled me up, he turned to guide me away before he let go of my hand. When he turned back, he could see the bare feet of someone standing at the bottom of the cellar. Because of the cellar's dilapidated structure, he could only see their feet and part of their legs. He never saw them come up the cellar stairs though, or move away from them before he followed me. I didn't believe him at first and thought he was just trying to scare me, but I could tell by the serious tone of his voice and the silent look he gave me after telling me that he was not trying to make a joke. We stood for a second, not really saying anything. We both agreed to go back towards our cars. We stood by them for a while, watching the house to see if anything or anyone would come out, but there was no movement at all. After talking for a bit about how crazy that was, and him reassuring me he was telling me the truth, it started to rain. We decided to call it a night. I haven't gone back to the house since then. I like to tell myself that whoever was in that house must just be a homeless person finding shelter or something, but I still get chills to this day, thinking about how close that person was to me as I scrambled up from the cellar.